topic of transportation equity, she's also published on the socioeconomics of zero-car households and has published on gentrification in transit-oriented neighborhoods. Her work has also examined the socio-demographics of travel more broadly, publishing papers on household labor in traveling gay and lesbian households, lots of papers on millennials and travel. Some of you read those last quarter. And also on public transit. She's published work on bus rapid transit, neighborhood change, from, I believe that was from your APRP, yes?
Yep, that was from my client project.
Yep. And so I want you all to publish your, and related to millennials' work, she's also published on the neighborhood characteristics of travel. And if that were not enough, Anne has also studied and published on transportation finance, including the history of transportation finance, the gas tax, local option sales taxes. You get the point. I didn't even mention the Carmageddon paper. She's an active and productive scholar, and after graduation, she will have what we're calling around here the world's shortest postdoc, which will run a few weeks. Because she's then off to Eugene, Oregon to take up residence there as a new professor of planning at the University of Oregon. And we'll be teaching there starting this fall. So without further ado, here's that dissertation I'm telling you.
Hey everyone, it's good to be here with you. It doesn't feel like it's been 6 years, but it is 2018, so math doesn't lie, I guess. I'm excited to share my dissertation work with you. The only people I've gotten to share it with so far are at my job talk, so it's good to be here on my home turf sharing it with you. So I want to start off today talking a little bit about the existing mobility divide, specifically the divide in car access and car ownership. I imagine you've talked a lot about this in some of your classes, but I just want to start the conversation there so that we can fit these shared mobility services into the conversation. So thinking about where are we now and what do these new services have, what are the implications for the equity and then the mobility. I'm going to spend most of today, though, talking about my dissertation work on ride-hail and taxi service in LA. And specifically, I was investigating where are ride-hail services, who's using them, and then is there discrimination on taxi and ride-hail services? And again, I'll get into what really motivated me to ask these questions. But in case you do have to step out early, I'm going to preview my main findings. First, ride-hail, specifically Lyft, extends car access to nearly every neighborhood in LA County. It's pretty remarkable. Second, the most heavily used areas are those neighborhoods with the lowest access to personal cars. So it's the strongest predictor of Lyft use in a neighborhood is how little car access the residents themselves have. So suggesting that there is this expansion of car access with these services. And then the last piece is that I find pretty rampant discrimination in the taxi industry still. So there's been decades and decades long of research on taxi discrimination, and it's still very much so active here in LA. The good news is that on ride-hail, it narrows the gap substantially, almost erases the gap between riders, but there is still some gap that we can improve on. So I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about what other steps we might be able to take to close the gap entirely. So the existing mobility divide, most households in the US do own cars, but 10 million households do not. So for those households, they're not distributed evenly across the population. They're disproportionately low income and non-white. And a car translates into very concrete mobility outcomes, right? So research by Kelsey Ralph, who's a previous graduate of the PhD program as well, found that among young adults, the car-less young adults made 2 trips and traveled 2 miles in a survey day, whereas drivers traveled 4 trips and 24 miles. So you can see the car is really conferring some substantial mobility and then also access to opportunities. So the question is, though, if you don't own a car, how are you able to get around? Of course, there are ways to access a car even if you don't own one. So there's carpooling, which has some benefits. You don't have to pay for the car necessarily, but it can be unreliable and difficult to arrange carpools. There's car sharing, and then also taxis and informal services such as gypsy cabs. And I think taxis, I want to focus on them for just a little bit because I think they're a really nice window into how important that occasional car access can be. They have a really bimodal distribution of incomes. They're disproportionately used by the very high income travelers. You can imagine they're business travelers. and then also very low income. So there's people who need occasional access to a car who might not own a car otherwise. So for example, among low income households, they make 17% of trips, but 41% of taxi trips. So you can see there's this disproportionate use among a group who has lower access to their own personal cars. So there's clearly a need for occasional access to cars among low-income households and those without cars. But there's a problem with these taxis, right? So taxis, they're providing this lifeline car service for many households, but there's rampant discrimination, so across space and across individuals. So there's a number of studies, both in the media and also researchers, that look at the neighborhood service of taxis, so where taxis are serving, what neighborhoods. And they find that there's very poor service often in low-income neighborhoods, communities of color, so taxis are refusing to drive there, they're refusing to take riders to these neighborhoods. And there's a couple of potential reasons for this that researchers cite, as well as taxi drivers themselves. So first is that there's imperfect information. So if you're a taxi driver, you don't know where other drivers are, and you don't know where other riders are, right? And so you're going to guess where other riders are. So you're going to often they drive to these places where they expect riders to be. So that's airports, it's places like downtowns, hotels, etc. So they're not going to where riders actually are. They're going to where they think they are. So they could be missing a rider that's right next to them, but they don't know that they're there. Another is economic discrimination. So this comes in a couple forms, but the primary way, and there's a lot of research out of New York looking at this, especially the different boroughs. For example, a taxi driver will often not want to drive to a far out neighborhood or a low-income neighborhood because they worry they're not going to get a fair paying trip on the way back. So in that way, they're going to be wasting that time and gas coming back. So they will refuse potentially to drive to a neighborhood. You say, I want to go to this neighborhood. They say, no, I'm not going to take you there. Another is just overt racism. So denying people a ride based on their race, ethnicity, or gender. So there's a couple different combinations. Or proxy discrimination. And this is when people use the visible characteristics of neighborhoods or individuals and use those to infer invisible things. So for example, proxy discrimination could be a taxi driver doesn't want to serve a neighborhood with many broken windows. They use that visible sign as a proxy for, say, safety, which is invisible. Also evidence of discrimination against individuals regardless of where they are. So there's a lot of, there's been police operations at LAX, for example, with black police officers trying to get rides and being denied service. There's studies in other cities with black and white riders trying to hail simultaneously, and the black riders are passed by taxis and the white riders are picked up much faster. So again, this could be a proxy discrimination using these visible cues for invisible other effects, or again, racism. So my question was, what about these ride-hailing services? They're similar to taxis in a lot of ways. But these ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft, they're connecting people via smartphones. They're changing kind of the calculus. They're changing the information available. And so can they change the equity implication? And the other reason I think it's really important to look at these services right now is they're providing a shocking number of rides. So they only launched in 2012. 6 years later, 6.5 million trips per day around the world. In LA, Lyft, which is the smaller of the two major ride-hailing companies, provided 5 times as many trips per month as all the taxis in Los Angeles, the city of LA. So it's about 1.7 million compared to about 400,000 trips. So 6 years, just blowing by. And that doesn't even include Uber. So we don't have estimates of that, but we can imagine. So this is the driving question. We have this history of discrimination in taxi services across neighborhoods, across individuals. So can ride-hailing improve that equitable access? So this is the title of my dissertation, Ride-Hail Revolution, Ride-Hail Travel and Equity in Los Angeles. And I'm going to go through 3 questions today. The first are, where are Lyft trips? So what neighborhoods is it serving? What are the characteristics of those neighborhoods? And what is Lyft travel associated with? The second question I asked is, what factors are associated with individual Lyft use? So these are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. The first one is asking about the trips themselves. So you can imagine Koreatown. How many trips are serving going to and from Koreatown? Versus the second question is taking the other side and asking, what about the users, the people who live in that neighborhood? If there's trips serving Koreatown, are the people who live there actually using it, or are the people who are going to just bars and restaurants? So I want to know, is service in a neighborhood actually mean that people in the neighborhood have access to these services? And the last question I asked is there evidence of discrimination in taxi and ride-hail services? So I'm going to talk about these first two first. So where are Lyft trips and what factors are associated with individual Lyft use? And to answer these questions, I obtained some really, really fun data from Lyft directly. It's a huge data set of 6.3 million trips taken to from within LA County during a 3-month period in 2016. So this data has been a lot of fun to play with and to kind of dig into. It's 6.3 million individual trip records. They're very detailed, more detailed than, to my knowledge, anyone else has been able to get. Lyft often doesn't think that they give out these data, but they do. So each one has the census tract origin and destination, the price, the distance, the day of the week, the time of day, if it was a Lyft line or not, and also importantly, an individual rider ID. So that way I can see, well, how frequently are people taking Lyft and what do those trips look like? So I think that the easiest way to answer the question, where are Lyft trips, is to actually answer the opposite, which is where aren't Lyft trips. So this is a map of LA County. Every yellow dot here is 500 residents. And I imagine most of us are familiar with LA. Most of the population, the density is in the basin, but it is of course spread throughout the county. And one of the things I think makes LA a particularly interesting place to study these is that because it is so huge, right? LA County is about the size of Delaware and Rhode Island put together. There's so many types of built environments. We can really get a sense of, is this serving across a range of built environments and neighborhoods? So where aren't Lyft trips? The only places Lyft didn't serve in this 3-month period are these dark gray census tracts. So mostly up in the northeast of the county. These areas were home to only 0.2% of Los Angeles County population. So that means 99.8% of the Los Angeles County population lived in a neighborhood that had a Lyft trip to or from their neighborhood. So it's serving really everywhere. So this map shows the Lyft trips themselves. Every dot here is 500 trips. So again, you can see the spread is essentially across the entire basin. Lancaster and Palmdale did have trips. It's just not enough to make the 500 dot density show up. And I know I talked at some point in a GIS class, so for anyone who was there, the 500 level was really to get the sense of density without totally overwhelming. So point being, not very many trips in Lancaster and Palmdale. So when you're looking at this, there are trips everywhere, but there is definitely a denser cluster in the kind of central area around downtown LA. Yeah.
So you said they're at the census tract levels. So are those like centroids within, like center points within the census tract?
So it's a dot density map. So what it basically does is for every 500 trips, it will, in that census tract, it will randomly distribute them throughout the census tract. Yeah. So exactly. So census tract can have more than one dot. So one thing about this map, though, is it certainly could reflect just the distribution of jobs and people in LA. So this map shows the per capita distribution of Lyft trips. So every dot here, again, within census tracts, represents 1 trip per resident plus jobs. This accounts for the density of LA itself. So you can still see there are trips throughout, but it's a lot less now in the eastern and northern parts of the county. So definitely more Lyft trips in this region, so Hollywood, downtown LA, stretching west towards Santa Monica, and then also up north into the San Fernando Valley.
Less than Beverly Hills. Less than Beverly Hills.
Yeah, which I guess is right here.
Yeah.
Well, and keep that in the back of your mind about income. That will come up later. So my first question was, well, what factors are associated with Lyft trips in a neighborhood? How many Lyft trips are in a neighborhood? So neighborhoods that are dense have higher shares of young residents. Our majority of the residents are Black or white, or have high shares of zero-car households. All had more Lyft trips, all else equal. On the flip side, neighborhoods that had a majority of Asian or majority Hispanic residents had fewer Lyft trips. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit more into this because it's very similar to when we look at the users, how frequently people are using Lyft. So just my point here is that the distribution on trips serving neighbor are very similar to the number of trips individuals living in neighborhoods use. So I'll get more into that. Okay, so switching gears, so I just talked about the trips themselves. Now I want to talk about Lyft users. So who's actually riding trips and how frequently are they riding them? Before I talk about the geographic spread and what factors are associated with use, I first want to take a brief moment to talk about just the general frequency, because I think it's something that we haven't been able to answer very well so far. We have some survey data, but this is a population of trips. It's a really valuable sample that we can look at all across all the people who took a trip during this 3-month period. How frequently are they using these services? So this graph shows the share of users on the y-axis and then the Lyft use frequency on the x-axis. And what you can see is about 40% of people take fewer than 1 trip per month. So really, really infrequently. Together, about 2/3 take 1 trip per month or less. So again, it's this occasional use for most people. It's not an everyday. I think when we hear a lot of stories or we think about maybe yourself, how often do you use Lyft? For most people, it's pretty infrequent. Although, of course, there are about 25% of people who take about 1 or more trips per week. So most people are pretty infrequent, but there is about a quarter of people who is a pretty frequent mode. Likely not enough that it's replacing every single trip, but certainly frequent. So when we think about what that actually means in terms of the share of trips overall, let me walk you through this graphic. So every person...
There's a question over here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
This was a 3-month data set, you said?
Mm-hmm.
What time of year?
September, October, November.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So this graphic, every person and car represents 1%. And so what you can see here is 1% of users, so this little orange person, makes 13% of the trips. So the most frequent 1% of users makes 13%. 5% make over 1/3 of trips. 10% of users make over half. And 1/4 of users make over 3/4 of the trips. So again, most people make a very small percent of the trips. It's a lot like transit in that way, in that most people ride transit very infrequently, if at all, and that a small share of transit riders are making most of the transit trips. Okay, so where do Lyft users live? Everywhere, right? So just like trips, Lyft users are spread throughout the entire county. In this map, every dot represents 20 users. Of course, how frequently they use Lyft does vary across space and across neighborhood. So this map now shows 20 frequent users. Each dot is 20 frequent users, and frequent users are those who ride about 3 times a month. So they're the top 25% of Lyft users. And what I find interesting about this is, again, they're still all over the county, right? A little more clustered again in this dense area around downtown LA and then stretching west to Santa Monica and northwest, but again, really all over the county. So there are frequent Lyft users spread throughout. So what factors are associated with individual Lyft use? What do their home neighborhoods look like, and how do those predict how often people take Lyft? People who live in dense neighborhoods, in low-income neighborhoods, in majority Black and majority white neighborhoods, in neighborhoods with high shares of young residents, and in neighborhoods with high shares of zero-car households, all take more Lyft trips per person. So I want to just walk through a few of these quickly. The built environment I found very interesting. It's a very weak association. The biggest predictors and associations are with the share of young residents and then the share of zero-car households. So those are bolded up here. And those could mean a few things. We don't know yet. There's some surveys about these, but again, nothing definitive. We're still in the early stages of all of this research. So with young residents, it could certainly mean there's higher adoption of young residents of these ride-hail services. It could also mean there's barriers that seniors, for example, face. So it could have to do not so much with a pull factor from the young residents, but it could be a push factor from older. And then zero-car households is the strongest predictor and the strongest association between the number of Lyft trips a person makes and their home characteristics. So again, like trips, it's suggesting that these neighborhoods with the least access to personal cars are the areas that people are using and relying on these services the most. So it's filling this gap, essentially, in car access. On the other side, though, people who live in high-income neighborhoods, majority Asian and majority Hispanic neighborhoods, are using Lyft less. So that frequency graph I just showed you, one thing I think is really interesting is this is about frequency. It's high income. So people who live in high-income neighborhoods take Lyft less frequently, all else equal. But there's actually a higher share of users live in high-income neighborhoods. So basically more people who live in high-income neighborhoods have hailed a Lyft at least once, but they're not hailing them as frequently. Okay? The majority Asian and majority Hispanic neighborhoods are interesting. We certainly don't know yet really what's going on. I have a few ideas. In majority Asian neighborhoods, they have about the same share of car-less households as all the other neighborhoods, but they also have a higher share of households with 3 or more cars. So it's possible that there are enough cars to essentially meet the needs. There's also high rates of carpooling in these neighborhoods. So it's possible they're using their auto resources more effectively, or they're sharing more, or there's other barriers we haven't yet identified. In majority Hispanic neighborhoods, the national surveys of residents find that Hispanic residents have lower smartphone ownership and also are more likely to be unbanked. And on Lyft, you can use a prepaid card to ride these services, but a survey that's just taken this year of non-users found that over 10% said that not being able to use cash was the main reason they didn't rely on these services. So even though they're offering prepaid cards, clearly some form of banking access is still a barrier. Okay, so again, Lyft is essentially everywhere. It seems to be filling a gap for zero car in neighborhoods with lower access to cars. But just because Lyft is serving a neighborhood doesn't necessarily mean that it's serving all the people who live in that neighborhood and serving them equally. So my next question then was, is there evidence of discrimination in ride-hail services and taxi services? So to answer this question, last fall, with the help of a number of UCLA undergrad and graduate students, I conducted an audit study. So these are studies, I imagine you've probably heard of some of the most famous ones, which are, say you send a resume out of 2 equal individuals with different names on them and see the response rates people get. So in other words, you're controlling for everything, all the individual characteristics, with the exception of one you're interested in. So all the riders were students. They all had 4.5 star ratings on Uber and Lyft or higher. So I essentially made them as equal as possible, with the exception of their race, ethnicity, and gender. And then was asking, first of all, how do Uber, Lyft, and taxis compare in service period? Because we don't have a good sense of that, except mostly anecdotal. And then also, how did that service vary across individuals? And were individuals receiving different levels of service based on their individual characteristics? So all the field workers were very excited. They got to shuttle between 2 different locations many, many, many times. Field workers spent about 1,800 hours total in the field. So we have a lot of observations, which makes this a really exciting project. So since we're all familiar with LA, to be a sense of where these are, the first site was in downtown Culver City, right by the Expo Line station, and the second site was the Expo La Brea station. So about 2 miles apart, pretty close to each other, but pretty different in terms of neighborhoods. And I can talk about that later if you have any questions, but I'm not going to get into it now. So what the riders observed were wait times, cancellation rates, and then also driver characteristics. So on each trip, they're recording the same set of time points, essentially. I want to talk about the different time points as well. So the really interesting thing about these 3 services is that they all show drivers' rider information at different points. So if we can expect that discrimination occurs when drivers learn about rider characteristics, we would expect that it would occur at different points along the trip when drivers learn or infer rider characteristics based on photos, based on names. So for example, on Lyft, a driver can see the rider's photo and name before they even accept a trip. So it'll say, so-and-so is hailing a ride, here's their picture, here's their name. Do you want to accept or pass? On Uber and taxis, however, they see it after the trip's already been assigned. So on Uber, the driver sees the location and the star rating, but not a name or a photo. After they accept a trip, they see the name, no photo again. And then on taxis, it's interesting here because there's 2 kind of points which discrimination might occur. Could be at the dispatcher level. So we were calling dispatchers. We did try taxi apps, and I'm happy to talk about the challenges with the taxis and their technology later if anyone wants to hear about that. But we were calling, and this is the way the vast majority of people still do hail taxis, even though they are trying to innovate. So the discrimination could occur at the dispatcher level, or it could occur at the driver level, and there's no way to really tease that out at this point. But what it means is that I expect to see discrimination in different forms. So for Lyft, when people are passing, the rider isn't going to see cancellations. What they're going to just see is this longer period of time between when they hail a ride and when they're assigned a driver, if more drivers are passing up on them. On Uber and taxis, by contrast, I expect higher cancellation rates. So once a driver receives this information about a rider, if they're discriminating, they would cancel the trip. Okay, something slightly different mechanisms. So before getting into the differences across the rider characteristics, I want to really quickly just give a baseline about the patterns of service across Uber, Lyfts, and taxis, because I think, one, it was pretty shocking to me at least about the differences. And then also thinking about, again, equity and the fact that taxis for so many decades have been the primary way that people access cars without owning one. Thinking about what does that mean for actually being able to access cars. So the first thing I want to talk about, again, not related to rider characteristics, but just in general, these are the share of rides with request cancellations. So on Lyft and Uber, about 4% of rides were canceled. And what this means is you were assigned a driver and they either canceled on you, so that means you can probably it's happened to me, it's probably happened to most of you if you use Uber and Lyft. You return to the pool waiting a new driver. Okay, and on average, what happened is that riders were assigned a new driver within about 18 seconds. So these cancellations don't mean that they're not getting a ride. They're just getting a delayed ride. In 4 cases out of about 1,400, the people were not picked up. There were a couple of reasons for that. The driver, for example, drove past the rider. They stayed parked and didn't make any attempt to pick anyone up. And so there were a few cases of that. On taxis, by contrast, 1/5 of trips were canceled, and this can happen a couple ways. About 10% were people waited for over an hour and did not receive a ride, which isn't great. The other cancellations were because the taxi dispatcher didn't pick up. The taxi dispatcher informed the rider that there weren't any taxis available, and there were a couple cases when the taxi did arrive and then drove past a rider. Okay, so there's a couple different ways. But the point I really want to emphasize here is who actually gets picked up. So when do you actually get access to a car? So between Uber and Lyft, 99.7, again, all but 4 out of about 1,400 actually made it to their destination. Okay, on taxis, it's exactly the opposite. So if it's canceled on taxis, you don't get picked up. So thinking about the mobility implications, and on Uber and Lyft, even if there's cancellations, you're still getting picked up. On taxis, it's preventing your mobility. Okay. Yeah, Dylan.
Question. So, do you know about what the consequences are for drivers who don't pick up
On
each
taxis?
of those? So, I
on
know
all
for
of
Lyft and Uber, I think it dings the driver's rating, right? Or something within their rating. But is there any consequence for drivers who just don't pick up a rider with taxis?
That's a great question. So yes, Uber and Lyft, there's certain thresholds. So Uber, for example, if you don't pick up if you cancel 2 or 3 in a row, you'll get a timeout, which means it'll usually say you can't pick up anyone for 30 minutes. Varies. The reports of this vary, and it seems to change over time because they're constantly evolving. On Lyft, again, there's incentives to pick up as many and accept as many requests as possible. So there are incentives and disincentives to accept all the rides and actually pick them up. On taxis, it's really interesting. I don't have the graph here, but the cancellations I observe in this study are much, much higher, or even the share of people who are waiting 60 minutes or longer are much, much higher than those officially reported by LADOT. And I think the primary reason for that is when you look at LADOT's numbers, the data themselves, they have this very large category that's called no-show, but it doesn't say how long the taxi took to get there. So for example, if it's 2 hours later and they say, oh, the passenger wasn't there, well, of course they're not there. It's been 2 hours. So we don't know what's happening in this really fuzzy no-show category. And so I'm guessing that a lot of them, by my definition of waiting only an hour, would actually be no-shows. And then in terms of repercussions for those drivers, there's not that much you can do. So you can call LADOT to complain, but in 2016, for example, there were 220 complaints total for all of the city of LA. I'm guessing that's not reflective of people's satisfaction with the overall level of service based on the riders in this study plus riders surveys from other cities. And I had a rider who actually attempted to call and complain, and the taxis picked up and said, oh, well, the person who accepts complaints isn't here right now. So in terms of logging the complaints and actually having consequences, and I'm going to come back to the accountability piece because I think it's a really important one, it's hugely different for the two different groups. Okay, so assuming people actually get picked up, this is a graph of the arrival times. So this is how long it actually took for the vehicle to get to the rider. So this perhaps isn't surprising, but it's in a way shocking as well. So Uber and Lyft, Lyft is the light gray, Uber is the dark gray, and taxis the blue. Uber and Lyft are really clustered on these short wait times. About 90% are within 10 minutes, including rush hours, for example. We had riders, I should have mentioned, we had riders in the field 7 days a week, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. So we collected all of these different time periods and days of the week. Yeah.
Did these include like Uber Pool or Lyft Line, or were they just the regular?
Good question. Yeah, just Uber X and Lyft. And the reason for that is because I was really interested in these sometimes very small wait time differences, and I didn't want it to be based on the algorithm to pick up people. I wanted it to be based on the driver action. Yeah, good question. So you can even see within over half are within 5 minutes, right? Taxis, of course, are not as ideal. So we see a huge tail distribution of how long it takes for taxis to arrive. And again, remember, 10% are over here. They were longer than 60 minutes, okay? And so you imagine you're trying to go to a job interview, for example. When do you hail a taxi, right? 1/5 of the time, you're not going to get a taxi at all. Could you get it in 5 minutes? Or do you need to hail it 60 minutes in advance? So thinking again about this access to cars and how reliable are these services, and can you even get a ride? Okay, so this is before talking about differences across riders. So I want to first talk about this assignment wait time. So again, this is the moment that I expected there to be a longer period of waiting for Lyft riders based on race, ethnicity, or potentially gender, because that's when the Lyft drivers can pass. So it's kind of a Lyft equivalent of canceling in a way. So each of these graphs, I'm going to show a couple graphs kind of like this. This graph specifically shows the predicted differences in assignment wait times, kind of comparing two groups of riders. Each one, taxis are in blue, Uber is in dark gray, and Lyft is in light gray. And each of these bars are confidence intervals. So basically, if it crosses this 0, we can't rule out chance as the differences we're seeing. If it doesn't cross 0, like here, it's not due to chance. We have enough samples that we can say there's something going on here. So the first difference is there's not a difference between men and women, with a slight exception on Lyft. So slightly longer assignment wait times for men. As expected on Lyft as well, we're seeing differences between black riders relative to white riders with slightly longer assignment wait times. So this is the time, again, between when the rider hails and when they're actually assigned a driver. Unexpected, though, which I don't have an explanation for yet. We certainly, as a researcher, I can always say we need more research. Unexpected is that there's also a significant difference here in Uber and also in taxis with the Asian Hispanic riders relative to white riders. So there's longer this assignment wait time for these riders relative to white riders. So kind of moderate support for this idea that when the rider information is shown to drivers, that discrimination is occurring, but not fully here. What I think is more clear and also startling is the cancellation rates by how they vary across rider characteristics. So I didn't observe any difference between white, Asian, Hispanic riders. So again, on taxis, Uber, Lyft, it's all crossing the 0 point. So slightly higher cancellation rates, but it's not, we can't rule out chance. Again, same with men and women, no difference really observed. For black riders, however, there's significant and shocking differences really between especially black and white riders. So on taxis, 26% of trips hailed by black riders were canceled by taxis, compared to 15% for white riders and 20% for Hispanic and Asian riders. Yeah.
How do the drivers of any of these discern the race of the rider?
So some of it could be, on Lyft it's the picture, partly, because I had all of the riders upload a picture with a white background. On taxis and Uber, it's name-based. So the riders were they had all like many names. So some may be suggestive of race ethnicity, some were not. It didn't matter, it seems. So some of the taxis, for example, when taxis get a call, they do get a name associated with it. And again, this could occur at the dispatch level or the driver level. And then I had quite a few, I think about 5 times the taxi approached riders and drove off. So they're seeing them.
And that counts as a cancellation?
That counts as a cancellation. If they actually arrive and then drive off, that counts as a cancellation, yeah. I had 2 cases where, specifically with a black male rider, the taxi refused to accept a credit card as well, which they're legally required to do. So there's a couple things that are packaged into that cancellation, and I'm happy to talk more about what those all looked like. But these differences mean that what it actually translates to is black riders are 73% more likely, 11 percentage points, but it's 73% more likely to have a taxi cancel on than a white rider. Uber and Lyft is about 4 percentage points difference, so we're still seeing a difference, and it might be hard to see with this color. Uber is slightly over the significance line, so technically it's not due to chance, but again, it's a much, much smaller difference. And of course, one of the reasons we care about cancellations and this assignment wait time is, in addition to did you get to your destination, how long overall did you wait, right? So these different graphs break it down by rider, race, ethnicity across the 3 services. I think the kind of most apparent thing right off the bat is just how much longer people are waiting across the board for taxis, of course, which is what that previous graph showed. And again, no difference between white, Asian, Hispanic riders, no difference between men and women on this total wait time. But for black versus white riders, black riders wait on average between about 7 and 15 minutes longer than a white rider on average. Controlling for peak period time of day, controlling for the taxi company. By contrast, black riders on Lyft waited between 30 seconds and about 1:43 longer, and on Uber, 11 seconds to 1:30 longer. So we're still seeing some level of discrimination. There's still a gap here, but it's much, much smaller. So the way I always think about this is, imagine we have a black and white rider standing next to each other. They're hailing a trip at the same moment from the same place and to the same place. A black rider could get a ride faster if they waited next to the white rider. The white rider hailed a taxi. The taxi arrived. And then a black rider hailed an Uber and Lyft. Then if they both hailed a taxi at the same moment. Because it takes 6 minutes on average for an Uber or Lyft to arrive, which is below this extra time black riders are waiting for taxis, which is pretty appalling. So again, going back to my question was, could ride hailing improve equitable access? And we certainly see it's not erasing this gap, but it is improving. And why might that be? So there's a couple of reasons why we might be seeing a narrowing gap. So one is it bridges this information gap, right? It's connecting riders and drivers in real time. So we're seeing, again, across space, they're not going to places, this is back to the Lyft data, they're not going to places where they expect riders to be, they're going to places where they know riders already are. And the apps themselves can push and pull riders based on the prices to kind of distribute drivers across space. Drivers also don't know the rider's destination, so they're not going to be able to turn down riders based on where they want to go. There's also a cashless payment system. So like this taxi driver that I just mentioned who said, no, I want cash payment because I'm worried that you won't pay me at the end of the ride. Okay, well, cashless, your information's already in the system. There's no reason to deny anyone service based on fear of non-payment. There's also the driver and rider ratings. And so these do a couple things. One is accountability, which we already talked about a bit. So there's actually recourse. If people are discriminated against, if they receive poor service on Uber and Lyft, they can complain to the company. This happened quite a number of times in the study. For example, there were the one time that a driver said, yes, I picked them up and I drove them to Santa Monica, which the rider said, no, you didn't. I'm still sitting here. And within about 2 minutes, they had had their fare repaid, and the driver then gets a ding and hopefully eventually gets removed from the platform. So there's a level of accountability. The other thing is that I mentioned earlier proxy discrimination. So that's when people use these visible characteristics as proxies for invisible ones. So rider and driver ratings might be a way to remove or reduce that proxy discrimination because it now gives them something else to use as a kind of an anchor. So for example, now the driver can see, oh, this person's rated 4.5 stars. I imagine they've been vetted essentially by other drivers already, so they're going to be considerate and kind riders. So it may reduce the proxy discrimination using these visible characteristics to infer about people. But of course, we're not all the way there yet. There are quite a number of policy and platform level interventions that we could implement to close the remaining gap. So I just talk through a few of those. So I'm going to talk through first reducing discrimination, and then I want to talk through extending access in general. So first, pretty simple, is bias training for the drivers themselves. There's a lot of psychology research on this, and bias training does actually work in most cases. At least it alerts people when they are essentially acting against, they're having these unconscious bias and they're acting in ways that don't necessarily conform with what they think are their personal held beliefs. So they say, I'm not biased against individuals based on their race, ethnicity. And they can say, actually, yeah, you are. And so it could potentially change people's behavior to make them act more in line with what they believe are their held beliefs. And one way to do this is to track driver behavior. So one of the great things about these companies, they have so much data, right? And they don't say they collect rider race, ethnicity, gender, etc., but they do periodically survey their riders. So they could survey the riders, gather quite a large set of information about their riders, and then use that to track drivers who are canceling and see if there's systematic differences on who they're canceling on. For example, alert drivers, say, hey, this is problematic, and potentially give drivers a chance to change their behavior, and if they don't, they get removed from the platform. So there's a way to track this using these huge number of data that the companies have. Another way to reduce discrimination is potentially to change what information drivers see and when they see it. So again, moderate support for this idea that there is discrimination when the drivers are learning about rider characteristics. So one way to change that is changing what they see. So on Lyft, this would be removing the picture. You could potentially allow riders to use pseudonyms. So you could pick a noun, you could pick another name, just allowing them to not use their own name. So right now in terms and conditions, it does prohibit impersonation, which I'm not sure if a pseudonym would count as that or not, probably. So that's one potential. Another potential is changing when drivers see the information. So right now they're seeing it right at the beginning of the trip. If we are delaying that information until right before pickup, you still get that personal connection that the ride-hail companies are all obsessed with because it creates a sense of security, and the digital trust profile is what they often call it. But if you delay it to right before pickup, the driver's now invested in making that trip, so they've driven all the way, the rider's invested, so the discrimination can go both ways, right? So it could be that drivers are also canceled on more by riders based on their race, ethnicity. There's not great data on this yet. It's future research. Another is in changing the incentives for canceling. So it could go, we talked a little bit about the timeouts. It could be harsher. So instead of 2 or 3, it could be fewer than that, or if it's not 2 or 3 in a row, but over a certain period of time. So again, there's huge amounts of data that the ride-hail companies have that could track this. They could also incentivize things like 100% acceptance rates, right? And then from the policymaker side, this was an industry audit, so I sent out auditors, riders, to test this, but it doesn't necessarily have to be physical. It could be. But again, with the huge amount of data we have, it could also be a digital audit. So the ride-hail companies track exactly what I did in the study. They track that assignment time. They track the arrival time. They track cancellations. They track all the pieces, and they could do this in a much, much quicker and cheaper way than the public sector constantly going out. But clearly there is some need for some oversight. Okay, moving a bit away from the discrimination side and back to the Lyft data across space, one of the things that I observed, as I had mentioned, was that there's there's higher use in neighborhoods with higher shares of young adults. And so one of the possibilities, and surveys certainly show this as well, is that seniors are using these services less. And so the question is, how might we extend access to seniors? Some of it could be related to smartphone use. And that's likely a cohort effect. So essentially, as the current seniors age, and then as the baby boomers come to replace them, we're going to see probably more smartphone adoption among seniors. Because if you look at groups who are 55 to 60, for example, right now, they have much, much higher smartphone ownership than 65 plus right now. So it's likely they're going to retain those smartphones. But there's some examples now that could help extend the access now. So my favorite is GoGo Grandparent. And these plug right into the current services. So for example, GoGo Grandparent, the senior with potentially the help of family, can actually pre-program in destinations to just a regular phone, so their home phone, and dials a number, presses, say I want to go to the grocery store, and the car will arrive. And it'll actually give a ring back number whenever the car has arrived. No smartphone needed. There's a couple other services kind of like this. There's one called Ride Call or Ride 24, and it's a totally operator-based system. So you don't even program anything in. You call up a number. It's a subscription-based service. They tack on a small fee for the use, but the senior, or specifically senior now, and they call and they say, "I'm here. I want to ride here," and the operator will make the ride.
Are these services built on top of Uber or Lyft? Or are they providing their own?
They're their own service. GoGo Grandparents partnered with Lyft at least, so they're definitely working together in a way, but they're not services offered specifically by the ride-hail companies. So they could partner with any number of ride-hail companies, including if Uber and Lyft aren't in business in 5 years. They certainly could still be providing service. And these services right now are geared towards the seniors, but they don't have to be. So we talked about smartphone use and ownership does vary across the population. There's no reason these services need to be restricted to just seniors. So they could be extended to any population without a smartphone. And another service I think has great potential is what's called Lyft Concierge. And they've been partnering with typically health centers to be able to call rides for clients or for patrons or healthcare people coming to the hospital, for example. But this could be extended to other locations. So what about community centers or libraries or other housing complexes, for example? So again, extending access to people without smartphones. The last one is thinking about extending access to the unbanked. And there's a couple ways to do this. So one possibility is integrating with our existing tap card, for example, or any of the transit passes. Now at Metro, at least, this is challenging given the technology. Currently, the Orca card in Seattle, so Sound Transit, is actually going to be piloting a partnership with Via, which is another ride-hail company. And they're going to be integrating it directly with their Orca transit card. So people can actually pay for Via trips using their Orca ID. And that's a way this card can be loaded at the fare venue. You don't have to have a bank account. TAP is a little bit, they're looking that direction, but they're not quite there yet. Another option is a card like the Venture Card, which is in Chicago. And so this, instead of integrating the services within the single card, so like the TAP card can pay for Metro Bike Share, could hopefully in the future pay for Lyft, Uber, etc. But the Venture Card takes a little bit of a different approach in that it's actually a debit card as well. So it has MasterCard numbers. So instead of integrating across these services, the person would simply need to enter the numbers on their debit card in order to gain access to these services. And it is protected, so if you lose the card, the balance can be restored, and you can refill the cash at fare vending machines. So it's a nice way of kind of bridging that unbanked gap. So I mentioned a few times throughout, there's still so much we don't know about these services. They've been around 6 years, but we researchers are sometimes a bit slow, or it takes you a very long time to convince companies to give you data. So we still have a lot we don't know. One of them is how ride-hail service varies across space. Right? So I looked at wait times and cancellation rates across individuals, but not so much across space. So one of the questions is, well, if the same individual were to go to different neighborhoods, what do their wait times look like? How do their cancellations vary? Another is, as I just mentioned, what are the types and prevalence of barriers? So I'm sure there's barriers we haven't even thought of at this point. But before we can address those barriers, we need to know what they are and how prevalent they are. So addressing the most prevalent on down. And then last, are ride-hail star ratings biased as well? So all my riders in my study had 4.5 star ratings or higher. So there's clearly discrimination happening even with this constant baseline. But a lot of research from customer service finds that customer service reviews are biased again, so much lower typically for, say, a black waitress, for example, compared to a white waitress. And there's actually a lawsuit going on in Boston saying that the star ratings for ride hailing is also biased. So we need additional research to look into this, because if star ratings are affecting the service people are getting, potentially being kicked off the platform, and they are themselves biased, then that's certainly not a way to promote equity. So a lot of remaining questions, but certainly making progress to promoting equity in shared mobility. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to questions. Yeah.
So you found in your audit that there was a 30-second kind of longer wait time for black passengers, correct?
Yeah.
So I wonder then, because thinking about that time difference compared to taxis, it's nothing at all. But what does 32 seconds mean for Lyft? Like how, like imagine.
The percentage, you mean?
Or, yeah, I was thinking like, imagine if it took a person 32 seconds longer to get a Google search results back. Like that would be a disaster for Google. But then how long, for Lyft to know that some riders are waiting that longer wait times, like what does that 32 seconds mean for Lyft? Because I have the feeling that is much more significant than saying like, oh, it's like, it's just a minute. It's just,
Well, Lyft certainly isn't happy about it. Clearly, they are aware of this research that I'm doing and are concerned, and I think they're going to be taking some of the steps that I've outlined here in order to close that gap entirely. And it is a bigger relative gap on Lyft. 30 seconds on Lyft is a longer period of time than 30 seconds on a taxi. But I think, again, bringing it back to thinking about what does it actually mean for people's ability to access cars. There's still a gap we need to close, but I think the big story is really the difference between the taxis. So taxis for so many decades were the only way to essentially purchase a car trip without owning a car. And they were clearly, and still are, doing so poorly. There's a lot of regulations on taxis. There's a lot of anti-discrimination. Taxi drivers can be fired for discriminating, but clearly it's not working. There's not this accountability. And so I think the big story, again, room for improvement, but leaps and bounds better than what we have seen in the past at least.
I just decided, because I was in the room when Anne shared some of these results with the folks from Lyft, and I thought two things. One is, well, there goes our getting any more data from Lyft. But on the other hand, they were really serious about I think, shocked, appalled, and right away starting to talk about what they could do to try and address these issues.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask about the Lyft data. How did you get it? What sort of restrictions did you have on its use, its sharing, and then did you sense from staff at Lyft any either implicit or explicit pressure on you to, have your findings look good for them or whatnot?
Sure, yeah. It was a long process, and I will thank Brian and the ITS board. So we had an in with Lyft, first of all. But I started working with Lyft in about August, I believe it was 2016, and it took me until about May of the following year to get the data themselves. So it was a really long process. I was on the phone weekly, sometimes multiple times, multiple emails back and forth.
So many lawyers got involved.
I was talking to a lot of lawyers. It made me realize I'm so happy I never went to law school. It was mind-numbing, but yeah, I learned a lot about data sharing in general, privacy. They have a lot of privacy concerns, especially because, for example, we're a public institution. So they worried about Freedom of Information Act requests. And UCLA lawyers have assured them that, successfully apparently, that there are a lot of safeguards essentially in place. But the staff themselves were terrific. They were certainly willing, if not concerned, and a lot of the sharing conversation in general. So I'm working on a project with Mike Manville, for example, at LA Metro about VIA and data sharing. Same exact questions come up, which is how are you going to practice the privacy? These are our trade secrets. So there are these continual conversations that come back. But I think overall they were willing, clearly. it was a constant back and forth that they wanted to give me zip code level data. I technically wanted latitude, longitude data. We ended up at census tract after about 2 months of convincing them that census tracts could not identify individuals. In terms of what control did they have over the results, they had none. So it's this really interesting relationship in that they needed to have no control in order to be able to say, look, we had no control over this. This is what the results are. This is an independent party. So there was no money exchanged or anything like that because there couldn't be any strings between us. But it was also a risk for them, right? So they didn't necessarily, they probably had a sense that, we're serving everywhere. We know this. But yeah, there were no strings attached whatsoever. So it was a pretty interesting process. Sharing wise, I'm the only person who could look at it. It's very restricted. I was working there's a little closet in ITS that I was working out of. It's called the Secure Data Center. And it's
Unconnected to the internet, a custodian doesn't have a key to the room.
So they were very concerned about the privacy of it. I can share if anyone wants. I can't share the data, but I'm happy to share. I can query it for you if anyone has any burning questions, because it is a pretty unparalleled resource that, to my knowledge, no one else has gotten data like these before. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to dig into it. I love playing with data. So yeah.
In the rider audit, with the same riders doing the same route over and over again, did you have riders get the same driver assigned? And how did you account for that, given that a driver might be more likely to accept a ride from a rider they've already seen before?
Yeah, this caused me some consternation. So Uber and Lyft was really interesting. There were a couple things I did to minimize that. So what I was most concerned about was what I called piggyback rides. So that would say I hailed a ride, and then person B hailed a ride, and my driver pulled up and the next person got in. Right. So I didn't want, that would change the wait times, and also potentially make drivers suspicious about what we were doing. So there were no more than 3 people in the field at any given time, and they switched between the modes. So they took an Uber, a Lyft, and then a taxi, an Uber, a Lyft, and a taxi. So they were rotating as much as possible. With all these precautions, we still did get 13 out of 1,400 piggyback rides. So almost none. I excluded all of those 13 from the wait time analysis. And we collected driver information. The reason I didn't talk about it is because it didn't actually change the results. So any of the discrimination, it did not matter what the driver characteristics were. But I think we had maybe 4 or 5 repeat Uber and Lyft drivers, so almost none. Taxis were a different story. There were a lot of repeat taxi drivers, and they certainly voiced some suspicions. They were going like, why are so many people picking up here? And one was next to a dentist's office, so people were always asking like, oh, did you go to the dentist? Do they take this insurance? And my rider's like, so they told them, you can't tell them you're doing research, right? You can talk about anything else, but don't tell them you're doing research. So the taxi drivers were a bit suspicious, or voiced suspicions, but I think the most important thing to take away from that is that these are essentially as good as taxis can do. Yeah. We had a taxi driver say, oh, there's seemingly a lot of people taking trips to and from these areas. I'm going to go sit around the corner and wait for another trip. And so typically, when I heard that taxis were being suspicious, we would stop hailing that company for the rest of the day. But there's only we had many different drivers. We had about, for the 400 taxi trips, we had about 300 drivers. So there were still a lot of drivers, but there were some who made a lot of repeat ones. So certainly could have affected their cancellation wait times. So again, interpret these as the best taxis can do. They knew we were there, and they still did really badly. So, yeah, good point. Any other questions? Rylan?
It's a really amazing data set you have, and kind of interesting because it's, as a former driver, the dot density map really mirrors the heat maps we got. The heat maps that showed us where we should drive to make the most money, to get the most trips. And you said that, really interestingly, that built environment was not a big factor in frequent Lyft use, and yet seems nonetheless that these trips are, or these frequent riders are geographically concentrated in more centralized areas. So I'm wondering if there's maybe some network effects that explain that in terms of just the availability, the availability of riders in certain areas. And also wondering about if you explored geographic variation at all between different geographies with similar built environments. So it seems like the San Gabriel Valley has a lot less frequent usage than the San Fernando Valley, even though these are very similar inner suburban built environments. And I'm wondering if you sort of examined that at all, if that's for future research.
Yeah. So in terms of the built environment, so it was statistically significant. So it says that basically the built environment is strongly associated, but the magnitude of that association is just totally eclipsed by the socioeconomic characteristics. And so, of course, these things are often related, right? So zero-car households and low-income households tend to live in these very dense neighborhoods. But in terms of the modeling, what says was actually the strong association was these socioeconomic characteristics. I haven't compared specific geographies. Definitely potential for future. One of the other things I'd say is that in terms of the network effects, thinking about just the density of drivers and riders, for example, they mirror pretty much what you'd expect about trip making in general in a lot of these areas. So people who lived in these dense neighborhoods are taking shorter trips, which are therefore cheaper. Just like other trips you'd likely expect them to be taking. The destinations are closer together. So that's totally possible. Something we can't answer exactly with this data set, so I don't know the wait times, for example, in all of those different neighborhoods. There is research from Seattle that looks at estimated wait time. So it's essentially, if you ping the app, it'll tell you how long do you think, or how long does the app estimate until a driver will arrive. And it is lower in low-income and dense neighborhoods, which because they're typically more central and higher density. So, but that's not the actual wait time. So the similar research has also found that the gap between the estimated wait time and the actual wait time varies more for black riders and white riders. So there's also some, variation there. And so I think it'd be important to actually look at the actual wait time across space, not just the estimated. But it's a good point. Yeah, Warren.
So I just wanted to point out, for those of you who had 250, that should ring a familiar tone when she said that the effects of the built environment were statistically significant, but were comparatively modest in comparison to the socioeconomic factors. You probably heard that 15 different ways from me and from the readings over that course. So this again is sort of congruent with a lot of research on the effects of the built environment and the effects of the characteristics of the travel and travel behavior.
Yeah.
You mentioned that LADOT has data on taxis in LA City. What reporting requirements do they mandate from the taxi companies, and how does that differ from what you have found?
So they actually have a pretty high mandate for data reporting. I went down into the belly of the beast and saw it. So they're struggling a bit right now. The person who usually handles their data had left about a year ago, and they have not replaced this person. So a lot of their reporting are now in manila envelopes, just lots of paper. So I spent some time sifting through that, and what they report things like average wait times. They report wheelchair vehicle pickups, wheelchair accessible vehicle trips. They report no-shows, and they report individual trip records, including how long it took from the dispatcher to relay it to a driver to then actually pick up. So it's very detailed, but there's not currently the capacity to, I think, make use of all this information and actually synthesize it into helpful ways for riders. And again, I don't think there's the accountability right now that actually would make the travel better, the experience better. Because right now, for example, there's 5 zones in the city of LA for taxis, and they have certain performance requirements that they're required to meet. And it's tricky because if they don't meet them, they could hypothetically lose their license, but I don't think this has ever happened. They are trying to make the performance requirements more stringent, but they're not that strict, especially when we think about Uber and Lyft service, right? So and again, like I mentioned, these no-shows, I think the reporting is coming across as much more positive in terms of service than it actually is in reality. And I think they're aware of that. So the person I talked to said, oh yeah, we know about those no-shows, like, we don't know what to do about those. So, yeah, go ahead.
So I've been doing some work on TNC partnerships with transit agencies, providing subsidized trips, and so I'm curious about sort of average fares and distribution of fares
Mm-hmm.
of Lyft riders, especially across income levels? I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but just sort of how.
Yeah, I don't have a graph with me, but I did look at low, middle, and high income neighborhoods and the average cost of trips. And it varies basically what you'd expect it to. So the trips in low income neighborhoods are cheaper, the trips are shorter. In high income neighborhoods, they are longer and more expensive. There's also a lot more airport trips in high income neighborhoods, and those are the longest and the most expensive trips. I didn't bring maps of them, but I am happy to share my dissertation now that it's finished with you. There's some fun maps that almost broke my computer with showing the network of airport trips. It's pretty impressive how far people will travel on Lyft, for example, to get to LAX. They're basically coming from the border of Mexico, which was pretty surprising. Yeah, in general, they're more expensive in higher income neighborhoods on average. There are, it's hard to summarize with so many different people. So there's of the residents who live in LA, there's 570,000 users. So it's hard to, say this is what people who live in low income neighborhoods do, but on average.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but some evidence of differences is that the preponderance of Lyft line use is much higher in low-income neighborhoods and Lyft Classic in higher income neighborhoods.
Exactly.
Which suggests more price sensitivity.
Definitely. Yeah, so about a third of the trips, or 30% of trips were on Lyft line in general, and much higher, I can't remember the exact percentage off the top of my head, but much higher use in low income and then kind of moderate and middle income, and the lowest use in the higher income neighborhoods, yeah.
Hi. In the discrimination analysis, I noticed that you analyzed Hispanic and Asian riders together.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the results would have been any different if you'd analyzed them separately?
I tested that. They were not. The main reason I grouped them together was just for sample size, but I did test technically the two samples separate, and they were the same.
Also, did you find what the average length of trips overall is?
Like distance?
Yeah.
This is one of my favorites because it totally shocked me. The distance was about 2 miles on Google Maps, and most of the trips were within that, except for taxis. So about 10% of the taxi trips went more than 4 miles, which is twice as long as you technically need to drive. And so taxi, the price of the trip goes up with distance traveled and miles and minutes, right? And so the average price, the trips were going up to $20, for example, where they could be 8. They were ranging a huge amount. And so I'm not sure why these were so much longer. It wasn't one driver making repeatedly long trips. It was essentially a lot of drivers occasionally making these very long trips. When I talked to the riders themselves, they said, well, they seem to be making these very long, kind of the major arterial trips, but also sometimes they go, this driver's going really far out of the way. Another interesting difference between taxis and Uber and Lyft is that taxis they often had GPSs, but they wouldn't use them. Oh, sorry.
I just found it funny.
Oh, yeah. Well, it is kind of funny. I mean, they have this resource, and it's really interesting also because that could mean they're running into congestion. They would often, so they're both along, Washington? And they're going all the way north, under the 10, and around, which is kind of mind-blowing. And so, again, thinking about the affordability of car access and the fact that, what do you do as a taxi rider? In Uber and Lyft, if they take a really long ride, you can complain right to the company, and they will usually refund your trip. Yeah, Dylan.
So, based on your research, do you see any good reason for taxi companies to continue to exist? Besides, maybe some equity implications, but I mean, you address that in future research of looking at options like the venture card in Chicago or something to be able to get first-time banking. But it just seems like, what is the public interest in something that's this bad?
So one of the questions I asked all my writers after we completed this research, I interviewed them all and said, I wanted to ask them about these specific questions. And I said, what do you think taxi companies should do to make you ride them again, to improve? And they said, they should just be Uber and Lyft. So it's such a departure from this status quo of this such poor service. They need to do a lot if they're going to actually remain in business. I certainly sympathize with the drivers, right? It's a hard place to be when your industry is essentially shrinking. But for example, taxi companies have essentially had a monopoly over this for so long. They're kind of like Greyhound, which provided such bad service and then Bolt and Megabus came around. Now you're starting to see some new Greyhound buses because maybe they need to provide better service. So I did test quite a few taxi apps, which were interesting. The one that looks most like Uber and Lyft, I was not able to hail a single ride. So I successfully tested it here in Westwood, but when I sent riders out in the field, they had 32 attempts and could not get a ride. So we tried some other apps. LA Yellow Cab has an app called Ride Yellow. This one tried to pick the rider up a half mile from where they had put in the destination and tried to drop them off a half mile from where they wanted to go. The address was correct, but somehow in the app transmission, it didn't process correctly. Other ones, it would never load. So they technically had an app, but it literally wouldn't load on your phone. So again, if they're going to stay in the game, what does this mean? And I think this has some implications too for mobility, thinking about connecting to transit. Thinking about right now, cities give out vouchers for taxis, which are more expensive, less reliable. So maybe they should be considering ride-hail vouchers.
Real quick, I mean, you said you feel for the drivers, but like it seems like a lot of the issues were just around driver exclusive behavior, like just choosing not to use GPS or like driving right past a potential fare. Like that's not because your platform is bad. That's just like driver behavior.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the accountability piece. So I think that if taxis want to again stay in business, they need to be.
So the question I raised is whether there's somehow differences in sort of racist attitudes between taxi drivers and Uber and Lyft drivers, or just simply that the platform makes it more difficult for those to be expressed. And that's a really important question.
Yeah, Robbie.
I'm curious about the taxi. How many taxi companies you used in the audit, and if there was any sort of significant difference between them.
So because the sites were in Culver City, one was in Culver City, one was in the city of LA. They're technically different companies licensed to pick up because that's how taxi companies work. And so in both of them, I used United or taxi cab, so that operate in both. But I had two companies in each. So I picked the largest companies in each location. So the La Brea Expo Line Station was United and LA Yellow Cab, and the Culver City was United and Independent Cab. And Independent actually was the only one that was significantly different. It had longer wait time. So I did control for the cab company on all these, and I think it's the smallest one, but it was longer than all the others as well. So yeah.
With this data set, were you able to make any inferences about surge pricing and how that works? Because I feel like it's kind of opaque to the general.
Yeah, this I have on here somewhere. Here we go. Okay, so this isn't surge pricing, this is peak pricing. So looking at the peak hour, so very light gray, sorry if it doesn't come out very well, but here's 4 to 7. So what I thought was really interesting about this is the average fare for the field work. And you can see that from 4 to 7, there is a bump up in prices for all of them. But what I thought was most interesting was the taxi prices, because taxis advertise as having the same fare no matter what, right? This consistent fare.
It's not advertised, it's required by law.
It's required by law, but it's one of their ways that they really argue against Uber and Lyft. Like, you don't know what they're going to charge you, and we always have the same rate. So this is one of their advertising methods, but I actually found more variation in the taxi fare than I did in Uber and Lyft. And that's because of the longer routes they're taking. And then also this bump up here in pricing was related to they're sitting in congestion, right? And it's charging per minute and per mile. So this is something I didn't expect to find necessarily, was that there was greater variation because that price is mandated by law. Surge pricing, are you interested in Lyft as well from that data set, or this one?
I mean, just if you had any general inferences about like the average amount of surge, just based on this, it looks like the percentage of surge is not actually that much, especially in place.
No, the variation between like even the same time of day could be very different. This is the average across all the rides based on weekday time of day. The most expensive period was Friday afternoon, and I think almost all of the 10% of the most expensive trips were all in that period. So it was pretty predictable, but it squares pretty much with my own anecdotal thinking about when Uber and Lyft are expensive. I don't take taxis, I admit. Yeah.
A follow-up to the question about distance of trips. From the Lyft data set that you got, do you recall sort of like an average distance, not from the audit, but from the data set?
It was about 7 miles. It was shorter I think it was about 6 miles in low-income neighborhoods and about 10 miles in the higher-income neighborhoods. Again, airport trips are the longest. The longest was about 500 miles. There's some up to the Bay Area, some to Vegas.
And if you hold airport out, it drops down a little bit.
If you
right?
hold airport, it does drop down by about a half mile or so. So yeah.
So does the fact that Uber and Lyft have a minimum fare play into this at all? Because at 2 miles, you're kind of, if they didn't have that fare, you'd be closer to sort of $4 or $5 maybe. But since they have like that $4 minimum plus the booking fee, you can't really get a trip cheaper than $6. So does that sort of?
Yeah, I think the cheapest was, there were some in the maybe high 4s. And that was partly because sometimes my riders had discounts because the app would generate it and they would use it, which was great. Made our budget a little easier. So yeah, that's definitely, the taxis also have a minimum fare, right? So yeah, I can't go
They
too much
have
below.
the taxis have a booking fee, but do they have like a minimum? I don't know. That
There's essentially a charge that will go on the meter right away.
Right,
when you
right.
get
So that's the booking fee. But
Yeah.
So Uber and Lyft, so they all have a booking fee, and then Uber and Lyft also have an additional like
Service,
$4
yeah.
minimum.
So taxis did not, I do not believe they had a minimum fare.
Isn't it so much for the first 8th mile? It's a big chunk for
Yeah.
the first 8th mile.
Right. And then after that it
Yeah.
just goes incrementally. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
Have you shared your findings with the city?
Have I?
Yeah.
I have not, but I will on Tuesday.
The ink is still like
Yeah.
wet.
Submitted Tuesday. So it's coming. I'm definitely planning on doing that. And I've talked to different groups, but they haven't seen. I have a list of people who I have to send this research to when I complete it, but it's been growing over about 6 months. So I will be sending it out this week. Yeah.
You said that the audit, you had the riders go back and forth between Expo La Brea and Culver City. Did you notice any difference in the waiting times and cancellation rates when the trip was starting in one or the other?
I didn't, which I actually thought was very interesting. So, like I said, one of the things I'd be interested in testing, one of the reasons I only had 2 locations is because I was really interested in the variation across riders, right? And so I wanted to hold those locations as constant as possible. So I didn't want to say, oh, well, maybe the cancellation was because this person was in this spot at this time. I wanted to hold those locations constant. I'd be interested to test if you really do get different service in multiple locations. I didn't between these 2. And they're pretty different neighborhoods, which is really interesting. They're only 2 miles apart, but downtown Culver City is much wealthier. It's majority white, and the other one is right between, Crenshaw and Baldwin Hills, so it's a Black and Hispanic neighborhoods mostly. So they're pretty different. And taxi drivers occasionally did make comments to my riders about like, oh, you shouldn't be standing here. When I've looked at the crime data, it's totally fine. But they have these ideas, which is one of the reasons, in general, in my studies, I looked at majority white, Black, Hispanic, Asian neighborhoods because I wanted to capture that perception potentially of drivers and riders about what might they think about neighborhoods. So yeah, that's a good question.
I think we're going to have to close. So let's thank you.
And Brian has been hyping this talk.